whole lot has happened in the world of FPV video links lately. DJI released the O3 Air unit and the goggles too, and Walksnail has released a new firmware that some say finally puts it on par with DJI. Today's the day we're going to find out. I have got a whole bunch of tests lined up for you. Walksnail, O3 Air unit, Caddx Vista, DJI V2 goggles. We're going to run through them all and we're going to see how they stack up. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're going to learn something today. The firmware that we're talking about in this video is 28.32.10, and that is the latest official release at the time of this video. I know that there is just actually a couple days ago a new beta release that was put out that some people are saying is very impressive, but I prefer to test official releases because betas, sometimes with Walksnail, a beta is, one step forward, two steps back. So we're going to be testing 28.32.10, and I'm going to be doing something a little bit different in this video, which is I am going to be trying to make the system look as good as it freaking possibly can. A lot of times when I test a system, and specifically when I've tested the Walksnail system in the past, I know that the Walksnail antennas are really bad. And I have not upgraded the Walksnail antennas on my quadcopter. In some of the tests, I didn't upgrade the antennas on the goggles either, although I got over that real freaking quick. And I do that because I want the manufacturers to be held accountable. If they're shipping bad antennas, I want them to do worse in tests so that they are incentivized to ship good antennas. But I think I've made my point by now, and I'm going to go ahead and try and reflect more of the experience of someone who is committed to the system and wants to get the most out of it. So on the goggles, I'm going to be using these TrueRC X-Air patch antennas. Oh, they're technically crosshairs. They're not patches, but they're directional antennas. And I'm going to be using these Lumineer Axi HD Omni antennas. And in case you're wondering why I'm not using like a dual directional antenna like the X2 Air, I've got a video I made about how that affects coverage pattern and why I don't do that, and I'll put a link down in the video description if you want to check that out. On the quadcopter, I've got these Lumineer Axi antennas. They're sold as replacement antennas for the Caddx Vista, so they should work just fine with the Walksnail system as well. And I'm just going to assume, based on Lumineer's reputation with their Axi line, it's made by Hugo from TrueRC, so they're basically TrueRC antennas, and I'm going to assume they're on par with the best quality antennas you could get for FPV. So our first test is going to be the Walksnail system at 700 milliwatts, 720p, high frame rate, and 25 megabits per second. And this is just going to provide a baseline for comparison going forward. In reality, we might run 1080p, we might run 50 megabits per second. The other thing I want you to know is that this is not DVR. Since Walksnail makes it so easy to output HDMI, well, I've gone ahead and used an HDMI capture card. I am recording this on my laptop in basically, I've got a lossless profile, so this should basically be as close to the real thing as possible. While you're watching this, make sure that you set YouTube to 4K resolution if at all possible, because even though this video is not 4K, it's only 720p, I've rendered it in 4K to force YouTube to give you the best, highest quality, highest bitrate image possible. And if you're watching this at less than, say, 1080p, you're actually seeing worse quality than I see in the goggles, and you can't really judge. For this first run, I want to show you the flight path that I'm going to be taking for each of the tests in this video. And then for subsequent tests, we'll just focus in on the parts where I think there's a difference or something to focus on. And I'll put a link in the video description to an unlisted video where you can watch the full flight of each of the tests if you want to focus in on them a little more. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one lap around my property. I'm going to focus on maintaining as close to the same flight path as possible. For example, during this part, I'm trying to stay right at about the level of the top of the fence, so my altitude stays as consistent as it can be. As we fly through this section, I am on the front of the antenna beam. This is where the signal should be the strongest. However, this is also where I'm flying behind that building and behind my barn, so we may see some obstruction there. Then as I come around here, I am now at about my left-hand shoulder, and as I come around here, I'm getting to be behind myself and will be more on the Omni antennas and less on the patch antennas. The second part of each test is going to be this run, basically from one end of my road all the way down to the other. I have turned around to face the road, and I am turning my head left, center, and right as the quadcopter flies down the road to try to keep the quadcopter in the main part of the directional antenna's beam. We should see that the signal is the weakest at the very beginning of the run. Then here towards the middle of the run, when I'm close to my house, it should get stronger. And then as we come up this side of the road, one of the things to look for is how early does the signal begin to break up. And then if we fast forward just a little bit, there is another part of the run where maybe it's the way the terrain is, or maybe there's a stand of trees or something, but it's particularly hard to get around this corner. The signal gets very weak. So we'll see how easily I get around the corner, and we will see how far up the road I'm able to go before I bail out. Before we take a look at the 50 megabit per second flight video, let's take a look at this chart that I made. This is the megabit per second, that's this orange series, and the latency for that last run that you just watched. And this part right here is where we're basically flying a circle around my house. I actually flew 2 circles, but I only showed you one. And then this part right here is where I start the run at the end of the street. I fly past my house through here, and then as I start going up the road, here is the end of the run as I'm going around the corner, and then this part here where the bit rate is high again is when I'm returning home. And we can see that it basically held full 25 megabit per second for the entire loop around my house. Whether I was on the patch antenna or the omni antenna, didn't make any difference. It was completely stable. In addition, the latency was relatively stable, staying around, here's the latency number. Yes, latency is on the right side, megabits per second is on the left side. Latency is relatively stable, staying in the low to mid 20s, and then occasionally jumping into the 30 to 35s with just a few dots in the 40s. Bear in mind that in past firmwares, the actual measured latency, as confirmed by both me and Chris Rosser, is about 5 milliseconds higher than what's actually reported by the goggles. And I'm going to assume that's still true, although I haven't tested that. So we should really add 5 milliseconds to all these numbers, but I'm not going to doctor the numbers. I'm just going to show you what the goggles reported. Now we're going to do the same test again, and the only thing that's changed is we've switched from 25 to 50 megabits per second. And we can immediately start to see some differences. You'll see this in the graph in just a second, but immediately you can see the bit rate dropping from 50 down to 40 or 35 as we come around the perimeter. However, for this part of the path where we are on the main part of the directional antenna's beam, we are able to hold a solid 50 megabits per second as we go behind the barn, and that's kind of nice. So it seems like we're not quite able to hold that 50 megabits per second as we fly around behind myself. See, as we come around here past my left shoulder, we can see it start to drop off. But as long as we're in front of ourselves, we are able to hold that 50 megabits per second, at least during this period. The instability of the 50 megabit per second bit rate is also on display here as I drop in to begin the down the road run. It's dropping down 10, 11, 6, 1 megabit per second even in the exact same location. And I assure you, my positioning was identical between these two runs, at least as identical as I could get it. And as I pass in front of the house, the signal is now at 50 megabits per second, but very early in this run up this part of the road, it begins dropping. It cannot hold its max bit rate like the 25 megabit per second did. It's still got more bit rate than 25 megabit. No, it doesn't. Here we're down at 10 megabits per second. I have no idea what's going on here. It just doesn't seem like the system can hold its bit rate as well. I almost bail out there. It just doesn't seem like it can hold as well in 50 megabit per second mode. Here you can see I'm having to gain altitude to avoid losing signal altogether. I try and keep myself honest and get down close to the road, but I can just barely fly through this nonsense, and I give up. And I think the answer to that question is finally yes. Here on the left, you can clearly see more details and less sort of blocky smeariness in the 50 megabit per second image compared to the 25 megabit per second image. But that is only going to be true as long as you're actually getting the 50 megabit per second. I think if you go watch both of the flights and if you really pick them apart, you may find that the 25 megabit per second image looks better on average I don't know. Like I said, there's a link to the full flights, an unlisted video down in the video description if you really want to dive into them. If we compare the graphs of the 25 megabit per second and the 50 megabit per second run, we can see the results clear as day. The 50 megabit per second run stays at max bit rate much less. And you might think that, well, sure, you're getting twice as much bit rate, so of course you would not be, it would be harder to get there. But if you're using twice as much frequency bandwidth, which they are, and the same amount of power, then you should be able to get about twice as much bit rate. And it's not entirely true, but when we look at the DJI comparison, you'll see that this is not as good as it needs to be. So the 25 megabit per second is pretty solid. The 50 meg shows a lot of drops, even all the way down to 1 or 2 megabits per second, and the latency is much less consistent as well. For most of the run, the latency is about the same, but then during these periods where it's really bad, we start to see much bigger jumps, even into the 60 or 70 millisecond latency, or even as high as 80, 90, or 100 milliseconds during that period where I almost fail-safed. Long story short, it seems like 50 megabit per second is not going to give you the same stability of link as 25 megabit per second, but does it give you better image quality? Next question, is 1200 milliwatts better than 700 milliwatts on this firmware? And that might seem like a really stupid question to ask. More power equals more range, right? Well, no, not with digital amplifiers. You can mess up your signal to noise ratio, make the signal more powerful but noisier, and actually get worse range and worse signal stability when you increase the amplifier past a certain point. And I believe that that has been observed with previous firmwares. In order to tell whether it's fixed on this firmware, let's go straight to the graph, which will tell us the whole story. Here we've got the graph for the 700 milliwatt run on the left and the 1200 milliwatt run on the right. And it does seem like there's a little bit of improvement at 1200 milliwatts. For example, at 700 milliwatts, when we first began the run down my street, the signal dropped very, very low, whereas at 1200 milliwatts, it didn't. We still were pretty much completely about to lose signal at the very end of the run, but that sort of makes sense for the end of the run. You would always run until you basically lose signal. And we did get a little further around the corner and a little further down the road on 1200 milliwatts, although the signal was pretty sketchy the whole way. And I think we also see just a little bit more ability to hold bit rate around 40 megabits per second here at 1200 milliwatts, whereas at 700 milliwatts, it seems a little more willing to sort of drop down. But overall, I don't think we're seeing as much improvement at 1200 as I feel like we really ought to. I didn't do this. I didn't think to do this at the time, but it might be worthwhile to run 1200 milliwatts and 25 megabits per second, because some of what we're seeing here may be the inability of the system to kind of hold that 50 megabit per second bit rate, whereas it was much more stable at 25 megabits per second, and maybe we would see a more concrete advantage. That'll have to be a test for another day. It's not included in this run. Now that we see how the Walksnail firmware compares to itself, the next thing we got to do is compare it to the DJI V2 goggles. Oh yeah, and we're going to compare it to the goggles 2 and the O3 Air unit as well. You know we're going to do that. But before we get into that, can I take a second to tell you about my Patreon? Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned it. The amount you subscribe at is totally up to you, and you can stop whenever you want. Patrons get access to my Discord server where there's a troubleshooting forum and just a whole bunch of super helpful, friendly people that you can chat with about FPV, and patrons get podcasts of all of my live streams available through the Patreon website if you prefer to listen to them instead of watching them live. But mostly, you hopefully get the good feeling of supporting the work that I do here. I've probably got about 3 solid days of work in recording and editing this video. I love doing it. I love feeling like I'm helping you and helping you make better buying decisions, figure out what stuff you want, and just keep up with what's going on in the world of FPV. And if you feel like I'm doing that too, then maybe today is the day that you decide to sign up at my Patreon. There's a link in the video description below to patreon.com where you can do that if today's the day. And if not, keep watching the content. I'll keep making the content. Maybe that day will come. Next, we're going to test the DJI V2 goggles with the Caddx Vista at 1200 milliwatts and see how it compares. And I don't know if you caught this before I put the quadcopter down, but I have put the exact same antennas from the Walksnail goggles on the DJI goggles. Not just comparable antennas, but literally the exact same antennas. So this should be a pretty fair test. Here we go. I have to point out that with the Walksnail, we were using a capture card, which means that any frame skips or stutters would be captured by the capture card and you would see them in the playback exactly as the pilot did. But with the DJI system, there is no way to do HDMI output and record the subtitle track that I'm using to put the delay and the bitrate down at the bottom of the screen. So we're using DVR here. The image quality is exactly as the same as you see in the goggles because the goggles just record the raw video input, but any skips or stutters that occurred, if there were any, would just be a skip and you wouldn't actually see the image freeze. It would just skip ahead. As far as performance goes, the bitrate, it holds 50 megabit per second all the way around the entire test. It just holds 50 megabits per second. It's rock solid. As we drop into this part of the test, the bitrate does drop down a little bit into maybe the 20s, the low 20s, maybe the high teens, but the image stays pretty stable and pretty usable, and it never drops down into those sub 10 megabit per second range where things would really, really start to break up. And on this part of the run, it holds the full 50 megabits per second way up the road, way further up the road than Walksnail did, just staying at 50 megabits per second, still at 50 megabits per second. Still, we're going to approach that corner where things get difficult and we're going to see it drop. Let's see how low it goes at the lowest. Here we go. We're going, nope, still at 50 meg. No, there we go. Nope, still at 50 megabits per second. 39, 34. There we go. Now we're in the tough. Nope, 50 megabits per second. It still pretty much holds on through that whole corner and continues to go up the road much, much further than the Walksnail system did until it eventually does finally reach a point where, oh, hang on, why am I turning around to go home? Oh, no, look at the GLS bat down at the bottom of the screen. My goggle battery is at 13 volts. My goggle battery was about to die. 12.9 volts. Okay, yeah, I turned around and came home because my goggles were about to turn off, not because of any sort of loss of signal from the system. Let's compare the charts from the Walksnail and the DJI 1200 milliwatt test. And it's really interesting to see how much better DJI does. It's just so much better. Look how long it held 50 megabits per second. It did drop down, but when it dropped down, it never really went below, let's say, about 15 megabits per second. It stayed in that sort of usable range. And the latency did go up, but even at the highest we were seeing latency, a few samples around 45 megabits per second, or 45 milliseconds, most of it staying down in that 20 to 35 millisecond range. It's also interesting how clustered the Walksnail latency is, whereas the DJI latency is more spread out. It almost makes you feel like Walksnail is reporting latency in a different way than DJI, but I don't know what to make of that. And in case you're wondering how DJI would do at 700 milliwatts, just for a sort of apples to apples comparison, here's DJI 700 milliwatts versus Walksnail 1200 milliwatts, and it sure looks like DJI mostly wins there. It holds 50 megabits per second more. We do see the latency numbers getting worse, but we also see the same thing over on the Walksnail side. And then at the very end, I just ran it completely into the ground. So there you go. What about Walksnail 700 milliwatts versus DJI 700 milliwatts? No contest. DJI just crushes it. So DJI is still clearly the winner at holding the bit rate, and I think that also corresponds to better looking images. I'm not going to go through and do a frame by frame comparison. As I said, there's a link to all of these flights down in the video description. You can go check this out and you can pick frame grabs and compare for yourself as much as you like. But I don't think that Walksnail can be said to have reached a level of performance where it is on par with DJI yet. At least not if you look at objective megabit per second numbers, and I also think if you look at subjective frame by frame comparisons. Walksnail is good. It's 100% usable, but DJI is still better. Oh yeah, you know we got to test the O3 air unit, right? Of course we do. So this O3 Air unit, I don't know what output power it's at. It's at whatever output power it wants to be. You can't change the output power. It's at 50 megabits per second, and we're using the exact same DJI V2 goggles with the exact same antennas that we were using in the previous test. And I got to show you the whole flight, right? I can't just show you a graph. We got to check out this camera. We got to see how the image quality performs. It's pretty freaking good. The more I look at it, the more I like it. I'm not sure that this higher contrast camera is better for flying, but it sure is nice to look at here in post. The colors are really oh, no, we're supposed to be talking about the link. The bitrate holds at 50 megabits per second through almost the entire flight. Just there, we saw it drop down to like 45 megabits per second. Through here, it's rock solid on 50. It stays at 50 even when I'm on the Omni antennas, even when I'm behind itself. The latency, we're going to have to look at the chart to analyze the latency, because the O3 Air unit has a little bit higher latency than the Vista, especially when it's used at 100 frames per second on the goggles 2, which we are also going to look at. But some people have wondered whether the better RF performance of the O3 Air unit means that you will get better real-world latency, even though the maximum or the minimum latency of the system is a little bit higher than the Vista. Here we drop in to begin the run down my road. Just get ourselves situated here, holding at about 20, 17, 14, 13, and away we go. 2021, still doing a pretty good job. The O3 system uses H.265, at least with the goggles 2 it does, so it can get better image quality with lower bit rates. Some people have speculated that it doesn't use H.265 when used with the V2 goggles. I don't know if that's been confirmed, but you can judge for yourself how you think the image is looking. Coming past the house, we're at 50 megabits per second. We're on the main beam of the antenna. We're very close, and we will continue down the road and see how long it takes for this to start to drop off. Holding 50 megabits per second. Latency is at 25, 30 milliseconds. By the way, the DJI latency has been confirmed to be accurate, whereas the Walksnail latency has been confirmed to not be accurate, at least on previous firmwares and possibly on this firmware as well, although I didn't verify. Here, we're down at 41, 35 megabits per second, so it is dropping off, but it's looking pretty freaking good. We're going to see how it does as we go through this corner where things get a little sketchy, down into the 30s. I think the V2 system seemed to do a little bit of a better job holding that 50 megabits per second. But I'm not sure if you do a side-by-side comparison whether you would think the image quality of this system is better. You'll have to check out that video, linked down in the video description, and you can go back and forth. Here, we're down at around 16, 17 megabits per second, but my goodness, it just seems to do way more with fewer bits per second. And here it's finally starting to break up to a point where it gets a little bit distracting to me, and we start thinking about whether to bail out or whether to keep going. I guess I decided to bail out. Now let's do it again, and this time let's do it with the goggles 2. And this is super interesting because that means we're at 1080p resolution, not 810p. We're at 100 frames per second, so our latency is a little higher. But most importantly, we've just got the standard Omni antennas that come with the goggles too. There aren't aftermarket antennas, high gain antennas available for it yet. How is it going to do? Oh, and also we don't have latency measurements because the goggles 2 don't give you a latency measurement. So we don't know the latency. We just have to, we don't know. But the bit rate holds pretty solid. Let's see how it handles flying behind the house here. Dropping down to about 44, 45, just like the V2 goggles did. I am seeing a tiny little stutter in the playback here. I don't remember seeing that while I was flying, and I think maybe my computer is having a little trouble playing back the video. I'm not sure if you're going to see it in the final rendered video, but I wanted to acknowledge it. So we're staying basically at 50 megabits per second for the whole run around the outside of the property, even though we don't have those higher gain antennas. How are we going to do for the going down the road run? The first test will be when we drop in right here. As we get close to the road, the bit rate should drop. We can see it's already starting to drop. It's already starting to drop, and as we come down close to the road, we're at about 20, 24, 20 megabits per second, 19, about the same as the V2, now down to about 15, and back up again as soon as we start moving. So about the same performance as the V2, which is really surprising because it doesn't have those high gain antennas. So theoretically, the performance could be even improved a bit more if we were using high gain antennas with the goggles too. And as we come up the road, we will start to see the signal drop, begin to drop right about here. And we'll just continue this around that corner and to the end of the run. See how it holds that bit rate and holds that image quality. I've done a comparison in my review of the O3 Air unit, comparing the 810p and the 1080p, and you do see a little bit of an improvement in the details of the image, a little less blockiness. Coming around the corner, dropping as low as 12. Again, no patch antennas here, though. We're just on the Omnis. So, I mean, the fact that it's able to get this far at all is kind of extraordinary. And something about the way it's handling the image means that even when it drops down to 10 or 5 megabits per second, I still felt like it was pretty flyable and felt confident continuing to go, whereas I just don't feel that way with the V2 system. It's really something. There's one other thing that I want to look at, and that is, does 1080p mode on the Walksnail goggles actually show an improvement? And you might think, obviously, more pixels means more resolution, right? But in my experience, when actually using the system, I didn't think that there was enough bit rate to actually give you more usable information. And there's a clear improvement in the 1080p image where we see a lot smoother lines and less jaggies. Here we got some jaggies here, some little jaggy lines here. Those lines are smoother. That resolution is clearly there. But this is a stationary image. The encoding of the image is not really being taxed. How does that actually play out when we're flying? If we look at these two images where the quadcopter's moving, I think the difference is a little less obvious. So let's zoom them in to like 200%. And yeah, which one of these is 1080p and which is 720p? I still think you could tell a small improvement in the 1080 image, but it's not nearly as clear cut because the moving image is really taxing the encoding and making it work. And in fact, a lot of times you will get worse image at lower bit rates. I specifically picked these two frames to both have 50 megabits per second bit rate. But a lot of times you'll get worse image at lower bit rates with a higher resolution because it just doesn't have enough bit rate per pixel to get the job done. So I'm still not convinced that 1080p on the Walksnail system is like, well, look at these bushes. We got blurry blobs. We got blurry blobs. We do have slightly less blurry blobs in the 1080. Yeah, but that's at 50 megabits per second. If it drops down to like 45, 35, 25, I think that the 810 or the 720p may come out ahead. And it's gonna, because we previously demonstrated that the system can't really hold 50 megabits per second reliably. You may have noticed I didn't even show you the 1080p flight. Yeah, again, there's a link in the video description down below this video to an unlisted video on my channel that contains all these flights, and you can scroll through them, frame grab, compare to your heart's content. Let me know what you think. Tell me in the comments and I'll be checking those out. The takeaway for me is that Walksnail is ready to be used as people's daily driver. At least I would consider it ready. I would use it as my daily driver if there weren't better options for me available. But still, it shouldn't come as a surprise that DJI is the gold standard and is just doing really, really amazing and incredible stuff. But there are things that make Walksnail better and might make you prefer Walksnail to DJI. For example, Walksnail has a very small, lightweight 1S capable video transmitter. DJI doesn't have that. And I recently did a roundup of 4 quadcopters, one with an analog video transmitter, one with an HD0, one with a Walksnail, and one with a DJI. And the difference in the weight of those really affected their performance. I'm going to put a card on screen linking to that if you want to check it out. Or if you'd just like to know more about the Walksnail 1S video transmitter, I put a Walksnail 1S video transmitter in one of my little 3-inch toothpicks and tested it out, and I'll put a card on screen to that video as well. See you there.